Today, we're going to talk about AI and what is the role of design and designers in artificial intelligence. Welcome, everybody, to a new episode of the live session interviews with this time Munyala Mwalo from Kenya. Welcome, Munyala.
Thank you, Asante. So my name is Munyala Mwalo, and I'm a service designer from Kenya. I have a lot of interest in different spaces for design, but then worked in mostly the agriculture space and the social impact space generally.
First of all, let's start with the basics. What is AI in your perspective?
Yeah, in the most human way possible, I think AI is intelligence, where either machines or tools or technologies have the ability to actually learn and adapt to processes, to communication, to everything, and even become better at it every day. So that ability of technology to actually learn processes, I think I would cluster that in the simplest way possible as AI.
And maybe for people who are totally not aware about artificial intelligence, is there like a very simple example that we all know as AI?
Yeah, I would say the simplest of what I think, especially in the context of where we are right now, is, and let me take it to the basics, completely basics, where you having a conversation with me and as a designer, and my role is to listen carefully to what you're actually saying, and then over time understand how to always respond to you and how to talk to you and create empathy during that conversation. So then that applies again to simple machines where you do you track a conversation or you track a transaction within a banking app, saves some of your details, sees how you transact, and then the next time you actually come back, it does most of the part for you because this is how you've been doing it over and over again. So that would be the simplest case in applications where they kind of track your processes and learn and do them again, or in systems to just understand how you actually interact with them. So I'd say from the human perspective, I think everything I think of is always from the empathy building point of view. So any machine that kind of creates that level of empathy and then has a conversation with you, from a very simple chatbot that you'll start having a conversation and it will ask you, what is your name? And then you'll say, my name is Munyala. So the next time it actually talks to you, then it actually refers to you as Munyala. So such context actually, I would say are the simplest modes of AI. Goes advanced more than that to robots actually learning how to do things the way we're doing it. In Kenya, I think one of the most common cases I would say is when we get machines doing what other people are doing. And in the tea sector, there were machines that were brought in to harvest tea. And those machines had the ability of identifying which leaves to actually pick the same way as a human being to actually identify. And the more they do it, the more they learn how to do it better. And I think that's one very relatable case in agriculture that we can actually use. Yeah.
Right, but you say actually the form of AI that includes the interaction with humans is of your most interest.
Yes. I think human beings are naturally storytellers, and I think I've learned over time, even in the design community, how storytelling can help. First of all, understand people and make people know what you really want or your intent, for that matter. Conversations also are very important. So listening to people, responding to them, makes you feel, for instance, in a case of mental depression or stress or something of that sort, where you need to sit down with someone and have a conversation with them. The more you feel like they understand you, the more you keep on talking, the more you'll always want to keep on talking with them. So I think that creates a very interesting point for design, for instance, because looking at the context of Africa, for instance, there has been a lot of things that have been happening in technology, in advancing technology. But then a lot of focus has actually been in cities, in towns, in places where technology is easily accessible. But then now advancing it beyond that needs you to, first of all, as the first initial step of interaction, to have a conversation with someone. And I think that is why I have a lot of interest in that before you do anything. And I'll give a very good context. For instance, I'm a designer personally. I'm going to do research in Turkana. I had this just a few weeks ago to have a conversation, an interview with a person in Turkana who is actually speaking Turkana. Now, it is my job as a designer to create empathy, but then since I don't speak Turkana and I speak English, I'll actually look for a translator to speak. So I'm actually seated here and there's someone I'm having a conversation with, and there's a translator who is actually a third party helping us to both communicate. But they will get at a certain point where I say something, the translation makes the person actually laugh. And I didn't intend for it to look like a joke in any way. So I'll start wondering what is really happening between me and this person. What has been lost in the translation, or what has changed in the translation? So such instances actually place a very good space for conversational kind of design or interaction design.
Right, right. But just from a more maybe philosophical point of view, is AI applied in bots not just a very poor solution compared to human interaction? I mean, what are we trying to solve here?
I think kind of bridging that gap of communication. Now, learning has been seen to be a very important thing for every human being, just always striving to learn something new. But then there has been language barriers, a very big limitation to learning, access to technology and stuff like that. Now, distance is also another element when it comes to learning. I think some of us, for instance, I'm in Nairobi, have access to internet and all that. If I wanted to know any information across the world, it's easy for me to actually access over the internet because I know how to read. And maybe I can speak several languages. But then you have someone in a context where there is only one language, there's a limitation of technology. The people they easily interact with kind of frame the context and the behavior that they actually have. So whatever they have been learning over time, if it is not actually changed, remains the same over a very long period of time. So when you have people having bad practices, negative practices, traditional practices like maybe, let's say, female genital mutilation and stuff like that, if their context has never been influenced by anything external, they will never know that whatever they're doing is actually wrong. So now, giving people the ability of, yes, having this conversation, but then also being able to have access to conversations beyond your own space, I think brings bots to this space. But then they have to be enhanced by artificial intelligence to actually learn every day, to improve every day. Yeah.
So the first key barrier that we can bridge through AI is communication barriers.
Yes, it's the biggest one. That is the biggest one.
But it often requires, primarily requires digital and online access. So what about applying AI for communities who are off the grid, who are rural, who might not have that digital literacy? How do they fit into the equation of AI?
Yeah, so I think one thing about AI is the channel of contact. It differs according to the location that you actually have. So the most important thing is to find a way of using AI within channels that people can easily access. If I am in a modern context where I have access to all these different technologies, I know how to use an application and stuff, it's easy. You have a diversity of context where I can actually use AI. But then in remote areas where the only thing they actually have is a very kind of low level 2G or 3G or less than 3G mobile network, data is very expensive. So they have interacted with technology through SMS and calls mostly. And if you look at some of the technologies that have been used, like in Kenya, for instance, M-Pesa, M-Pesa has been able to access even areas where data is not necessarily there because they are using text as a mode of communication. So now, how do we ensure that these people can still interact with technology via the channels that they can actually easily access? Which in this case, I think the most basic is text or voice interaction. Yeah.
Right. So, I mean, there are a lot of whiz kids developing AI machines, right? So it's great that they are there, but they love to be indoors behind their computer coding, right? So what's the role of designers?
Wow. So first of all, I think in any conversation, the most important thing that has to happen is that there must be trust created between two people who are actually trying to engage. I need to know that the person who I'm talking to actually listens to me. Now, so the question is, how does technology, how does a system, how does a machine learning platform know that this is what Munyala requires to know? Now, so the first stage I would say would be, I need to design a persona for which context I'm actually trying to use. And this is important because in different places, people have either translation, so not really translation. I would say, if you look at it's not really dialect, how do you call this? The accents. So for instance, I'll speak English from Kenya and someone would actually speak English from Nigeria, and you'll actually know the difference in that. That's the basic level of trying to understand the person I'm actually interacting with. Then there's a second level where it comes to characters and behaviors and attitudes and all these, and even social norms. Where in my society, if you say the word, what is the best word to actually use? For instance, if I say cow, I actually mean a cow in my community. But then in some communities, if you say the word cow, it's actually not a good thing to actually say in public, or not a good thing to actually say to older men or something of that sort. So such social norms and behaviors of certain context of people determines a lot how you design the platform, so that you don't say something that will actually irritate the person who is actually listening. And that requires you to build empathy with the context and the person that you're actually using. The role of designers, again, just like we always do, to try to understand these communities and these groups of people that we're trying to interact with, and develop kind of a persona that they can easily relate to, from the basis of what language to actually use, how to use the language, when to use the language, when to know that I'm actually happy or not happy, and then set those rules within a machine learning platform to actually help the conversation be more human. So I think, in summary, I think the most important is for us to make this conversation more human than it is right now. I think a lot of bots are very technical. You set specific rules, and then they follow those rules. And if you cannot, they cannot understand a rule, they will actually get stuck. So for us is to make sure that, first of all, how does it become more human? And this requires us to, first of all, design a persona that we can actually easily interact with, and then context that we need to interact with, and the situation within which they can actually respond. So I think that is the biggest role of designers in this space.
How do you see the process of developing new AI applications? Isn't it often the case that maybe a designer is being used to validate a certain prototype with users, versus should design really be the starting point, empathizing with the community you want to impact, and then use that as an input for AI development? So, and how does it work in practice? Really putting a problem or a challenge of a community at the starting point of AI developments might not always be the case. It might be first you have a basic AI machine, and then you might think in different application scenarios. So how do you see that? And have you experienced a particular project or example? Can you relate to how that process went? When were the designers involved in the process?
I think one I would say either fortunate or unfortunate, I'm not so sure. I think it's a balance of both. Is that a lot of concepts start from the boardroom, where we already have something that we want to communicate, and then we need to design around it. A lot of organizations are still in that space where they come up with a concept, and then now we are basically validating an already existing idea. I would say the best case scenario, and that's why I said they both are actually a balance between both. It has to start with an hypothesis at the end of the day. For instance, one very good case is what Girl Effect is doing with adolescent girls in Tanzania and Rwanda, where they have a platform called Chega. So they already have an objective of helping adolescent girls communicate or learn things, or have someone they can easily interact with. And in their case, they realize that conversational AI can actually make it more personalized, because every girl has a different need and a different scenario. But then the context in which they are also influences what kind of communication you actually have to them. But then, so that is an already existing hypothesis they create. We know that adolescent girls have a lot of issues. They want to sort them, and they want someone to talk to. Then comes the role of a designer. This is an hypothesis that we've created. Is it right? So first point is to just prove, first of all, that yes, this need that we've actually identified actually exists, and the context of the need is like this. Then secondly, to understand how are they solving their problems right now? Who are they talking to? Who are they comfortable to talk to? And why do they talk to them? And why are those people important? And do they influence them? And if they do influence them, in what context do they? So the role of designers to understand that context. And then thirdly, now to create kind of duplicate or replicate or mirror that which is happening in the local context into a system. So identifying if this is a mother that they always go to for information, then can we actually make the machine be that mother that they will always look up to? And it goes beyond even the process of design. So yes, you've done research, you've come up with personas, you've designed even mock-up conversations, because you kind of have to create an initial starting point where this is how a normal conversation over sexual reproductive health can actually go. So say, for instance, a girl wants to know why they're actually getting their first periods or something of that sort. They would actually want to ask someone, but I can't ask my dad. But then there's this context where I can actually text someone to tell me, and they always do it. So they will text the system, they will ask and stuff like that. So as designers in that first stage, you kind of have to even prototype that experience, have two people who are not really looking at each other communicate. And this is the tricky part, because traditional conversations are face-to-face, where I'm actually seeing you and I'm asking a question, and I can actually see the emotion in your face and all that. Unfortunately for conversational AI, it's not necessarily directly you listening to my voice or you actually seeing how I interact with you. So how do we create a context with which you can still show emotion through the conversations that you're actually having, to show me that, yeah, you're actually listening to me and you want to keep on listening to me and have a conversation with me. So that design process includes both research, prototyping, and actual one-on-one kind of having a lady who is actually an adolescent having a communication or a conversation with someone and listening into that and seeing all the possible ways it can actually go. And it goes beyond even after you've designed and the system is actually learning, to try and understand, so what has the system learned? What are the adaptations? Because now people will change according to how or what they're actually learning. How can you keep on improving and make sure that you're not giving them the same story over and over again? I think I was one of a big, there's a chatbot that was designed a few years ago in Kenya called Arifu. It was a farmer's information portal, where farmers would actually ask, I'm planting beans, how do you plant beans? And it would basically give you a list of what you actually need to do. But then it was blanket solution, where if you're in Nairobi or if you're in Mombasa in a different context, the response will actually be the same. But then now we're asking ourselves, if someone just did a statement, which is not necessarily, I want to plant beans, we can easily see an intent within that conversation. If they went beyond and just wrote a statement like, I wish I was doing beans instead of maize, then the system should be able to understand the intent of that question and have a conversation with them. So I think that process is really key, and designers need to play a very big role in it. One more thing I think which I've already alluded to, I think, is the role of behavioral science in all this. What does it mean when someone is trying to say this? And that brings the complexity now of artificial intelligence, where we're actually heading, where yes, we are actually talking about sneakers, but maybe what I'm looking for is not sneakers. I would say I don't really like sneakers, and then how do you follow up such a conversation to know that in this context, when someone has a conversation with me over this, then they actually do not mean what they're saying, they mean something else. That will be the next level, I think. I know some platforms are getting to that point, but then designers have a very big role to play in that space.
I love those two examples of the adolescent girls. So that's a lot about mental support and mental development, right? And learning, especially when it comes to taboo. It might really be a breakthrough to deal and talk about topics that have a taboo on through AI. And then you mentioned also the example of the farmers, makes also total sense. So if you give the the Kenyan or the African continent perspective on AI, which other impact areas besides maybe mental development, agriculture, which other impact themes or sectors do you see where AI could really make a difference?
Yeah, I think there are many. So apart from agriculture and let me say social impact, there's the other side of social impact where the development world is pretty much fundraising for some activities and stuff like that. It has a level of education and it has a level of fundraising. And one of the best examples I think I like, which is still not completely advanced, but then really interesting, is a platform by, I think it's Facebook Messenger, if I'm not wrong. Facebook has developed something called Walk with Yeshi in Ethiopia, where it actually depicts the story of Yeshi, who is a girl in Ethiopia, and how long she actually goes to look for water. And I think they use that to kind of create empathy with the development sector, where you can actually contribute to the life of Yeshi through understanding their life. So you actually walk the same amount of time that Yeshi would actually walk, but then during that process, you're basically having interesting conversations. So Yeshi is basically telling you about their place, you are telling her about your place and all that. And I think that is really big because it gives you a picture of what already exists. There are a lot of organizations that will definitely misuse that in one way, because the more someone is actually having a conversation in it, the more human it feels. And if you can be able to create empathy, then there's a level of ethics that need to be put in place to make sure that someone does not exploit that to fundraise for other purposes. I think that's a very interesting use case. And then I think also education is really big. And education is big because I mentioned earlier about the Maasai boy and Turkana boy. Most of these kids are actually dropping out of school, either because of getting pregnant or they become a moran and all that. And then they get into this context where there's nothing they're literally doing apart from having a small phone, which is not really data enabled, and looking at their cows in the middle of the desert, in the middle of somewhere. How can we use conversational AI to make them learn something? And I think given that they have all this time, creating a companion where they can start having a conversation with will have a very major impact. Reason why I'm talking about these regions, there's a lot of volatility, especially in northern Kenya, about either cattle rustling, about places like, let's say, in the middle of Sudan, where there's war, and all of these are actually perpetuated by young boys who are actually idle, and they're being used by older men or older family members to actually do something they wouldn't really do if they were actually alone. So having them within this context where we can create a platform that they can start having a conversation with, we can also use persuasive design to make them, first of all, learn new things, and then start changing their mindset over certain practices. In West Pokot, for instance, young boys would actually go and steal cows to use them for marriage. And they'd actually be encouraged by other boys. And one is because they don't really have exposure over, okay, the world has actually changed and this is not necessarily very important as we think it is. So then having these conversations with them and creating storylines that they can actually follow and learn from will actually open their minds to new opportunities where they start thinking differently about their general context. And I think that, for me, is one of the biggest things to actually happen. General sexual reproductive health, I think you've just mentioned, but I think education is very big in this context. Yeah.
Yeah, really interesting. And but as a designer, to work on a solution that relates to AI, it requires a designer to also know about all the possibilities that AI brings, right? So what kind of tips and tricks do you have for designers who have not yet worked in this domain? How can they prepare? Can they contribute and see the potential of AI? What would be your tip?
Yeah, I think the biggest challenge usually is understanding the, and then very specific on conversational AI, the process of natural language processing. And I think it gives a lot of very interesting possibilities to just understand, first of all, even basic chatbot processes and how they actually operate. How do you set rules and how do they respond and how do they actually work? Which is not necessarily meaning that I would want a designer to go too deep into understanding the technology behind machine learning and that whole process, but then to just understand the basics of what are the possibilities of natural language processing. what are the trends of that technology and where it's actually heading to. And then second, also to understand that there's a possibility in any channel of communication to actually apply AI, or any channel of interaction to actually apply AI. So knowing that, I think, is very important for a designer to just know that I can actually design for this space and in this space. But then also providing a space for innovativeness, where looking at the context of which people are actually going through a certain problem, provides the possibilities of using a blank canvas. And I also say this, I think for designers, I think we first of all need to use this blank canvas of what are the possibilities of us mirroring the existing system into either technology, or sometimes not. Sometimes it's either incremental or decremental. So beginning at that point kind of gives us the freedom to be creative. And I always tell people that I think developers also have a very big role to play, because I feel like development is not necessarily just a science alone. It's also a creative process to see, okay, so these people actually already interact with this platform. How can we use the same platform to actually change how things are actually done? And we were having a very interesting conversation yesterday with a friend of mine who's actually an engineer, whom we were thinking about smart metering systems within buildings, apartments, and how we can actually add on top of that a solar powered system to kind of supplement power for them. And he was telling me that they had conversations with one of the apartment owners, and they were not really seeing the importance of us using IoT, kind of an intelligent system that will basically balance out what kind of energy comes and all this. But then beyond even applying within that apartment, imagining that we actually have several apartments that are using these IoT kind of platforms, how can you connect all these different apartments and use it for something else, whether it's logistics or something of that sort? So understanding basics of how different technologies work, I think designers have a role to must actually just know the basics of that, and then use that to start designing, and as with a blank canvas as opportunities to where we can actually plug in as designers. I think that is really important. And then I think one more thing, I think for me that is really important for designers to understand. Secondly, I think ethics is another thing. I think one of the things that I will ask myself, for instance, a community has been having certain practices over a long period of time. And then empathy being a very big thing when it comes to persuasive design means that as an entity, an organization, or as an individual, you have the ability to actually change the perceptions, attitudes, and the traditions, not really traditions, the norms, how people behave and stuff like that. Artificial AI has its negative side, where you have the power to actually convince, you have the power to actually understand, because during this process, you're pretty much collecting a lot of data about these people. What you do with that data matters also. And I think this also falls in the hands of designers. Ethically speaking, what next after you've created this system that has the ability of creating empathy? And with that, to just mention something, I think, which is a very big role of, I think, behavioral design and research within this space, is that we are in the process of using big data in design, trying to understand that I will do my several interviews, ethnographies and stuff, which might be biased by a lot of things, either my own context, the fact that I'm either paying the respondents and stuff like that. But then you have things like conversational AI and other technology tools that are actively collecting this information. How can we start using that kind of information to create something like, I would say, data-enabled or data-influenced personas? So instead of just us applying the creativity process, also bring in the quantitative research process to create, to make more sense out of whatever we're trying to research. So yeah, I think there are many possibilities within that space that we need to kind of think of deeply as designers.
Really exciting stuff. I love your story, and we're going to continue this this discussion with the community. If you are watching this video and you are interested in this topic, do sign up for the proportion.global/community and join us in that live session. For now, Munyala, thank you so much, and really grateful for your stories, and look forward to continue our discussion next week.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for the time.